Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, and welcome to Bespoken Bones, Ancestors at the Crossroads of Sex, Magic, and Science. We're healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. I'm your host, Pavini Moray. Today, I'm really excited to introduce you to Stewart Blandon Traimon. Genealogy has been an obsession for Stewart for 30 years. He began by interviewing parents, grandparents, and other relations about his roots in Nicaragua. When he married his husband, Leland Traimon, 28 years ago, he took on the new adventure researching Ukrainian and Polish Jews. Stewart has researched his children's origins back to the colonial United States. Hi, Stewart. Welcome.
Hi, welcome. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be looking at ancestry through the lens of genealogy, because it's such a lot of what we're talking about on the show is ancestors and connecting more like spiritually with ancestors. And yet
Yes.
The genealogy piece is I have found it so important to kind of validate the information that I'm receiving, maybe like through a transpersonal lens. And so, especially in talking about your focus is really on queer ancestors, LGBTQ ancestors. And
Right.
I know that you speak on this, you teach on this. And so I'm just curious if you talk a little bit about Erasure and why it's so hard when we're doing genealogy to find our queer ancestors.
Sure. Well, one of the things that's difficult about it is because our queer ancestors were in hiding. We live in a very different world right now in the 21st century. I'm very grateful for that, where it's not uncommon to be out in high school. It's not uncommon to be trans in high school. And it's a wonderful thing that we're experiencing right now. But certainly in the 20th century and before that, our ancestors had to live in hiding. So they didn't leave a lot of records behind. There are no marriage certificates that we would find. There are no other standard things that a genealogist would look for. So I've put together a presentation that will be given to genealogists about where you might find some clues in what records and what kind of things you would be looking for.
Before we dive into that, because I want to get into the nitty-gritty of the how, but I wonder first if we could just frame it in why. Like, why is it important to find these folks in our genealogy per se?
So that we don't lose their stories. Plain and simple for me is, as a genealogist, I just love digging up stories that my family has forgotten about, that we've lost connection with. Why did that immigrant come to this country? What was their life like in this country? How did they struggle? How did they succeed? What other things have happened in my family history? Was there somebody famous? Was there somebody infamous? So also looking at it just through LGBTQ, we don't want to forget that we may have had ancestors in our family trees that were LGBTQ and that struggled, and what was their life for them like at that time? And then also, how did it affect their relatives? How did either they living in hiding or possibly living openly, how did that affect their relatives? How does that affect the entire family story and the family history that by the decisions that some people made? How does that bring us to where we live today, how we live today, because of the decisions our ancestors made?
Yeah, it's great. It reminds me of, I'm doing this dissertation on ancestors, and one of the things that several people who I interviewed talked about was the the connection with queer ancestors as a source of strength, of like really being able to tap into, oh, there were these ones in my blood. Like, and we know that, right? Because, at least 10% of the population is some degree of gender or sexual orientation variant from heteronormativity and cisgenderism. So like tapping into those ones as a source of strength of like, oh yeah, these ones live through these struggles, and by knowing them, I can feel that resistance. I can feel that power. I can feel that just like kind of solidarity that comes from yeah, great.
Right. It's confirmation also that we've been here. We've always been here. And so just to think that this is a 20th century phenomenon is ridiculous. And to know that we have had these ancestors and these strong people in our background is very important.
How do we start to find them? Because like you said, it's difficult, and I definitely came across this in my own ancestry of that because the ancestry is really determined by marriage and birth records and death, all those kinds of records, and so if those, like, they can just be invisibilized and erased in our family trees, right? And so how do we start when we're doing genealogy to find these queer ones?
So genealogists look at, as you just said, birth records, marriage records, death records. We also look at old photographs, the U.S. Census or state census. We look at newspapers. We look at obituaries. We look in cemeteries to find old gravestones. We look at military records. We look at marriage records. And I have examples in each of those areas that can give clues about how this particular person lived. When I'm putting together a family tree, when I come across an ancestor that was a lifetime bachelor or a lifetime spinster, that already in me raises a red flag. It doesn't mean anything. It just raises a red flag. It's like, why didn't they ever get married? And I just have that in the back of my mind, that when I maybe investigate that particular person on the tree, to have that in mind. But given that, there are also ancestors that did get married heterosexually, who did engage in same-sex activity. And so I also keep a mind open for that if I find any clues towards them. So, like in photographs, I have been able to look at old photographs or old family photographs, as well as there's a lot of wonderful photographs on a website called homohistory.com that show historic same-sex couples in intimate or just in everyday poses. And that's been just a great example to show. In census records, I would look for who they were living with. Were they living with other people of the same sex, or do I find them in the 1910 census, 1920 census, 1930 census, always living with the same partner? That would give me an indication that certainly this was a long-term relationship. What kind of relationship was it? It's not a clue towards sexuality. It's not proof for sexuality. But the census can certainly lead to clues about who they lived with. The census can sometimes also list someone as a partner. Now, again, partner is not proof that they were in an intimate relationship, but it's just another piece to put into my analysis that's to say, they were listed as a partner, not as a lodger or a roommate. So what does that mean? We look in newspapers, and unfortunately, we have a history of gay clubs and gay bars being raided, and people put into paddy wagons and sent downtown. Their names and sometimes photographs are printed in the newspaper, unfortunately, which at that time destroyed people's lives, got them fired, put strains on family relationships. But obviously, if I find an ancestor in a newspaper that was unfortunately in the wrong place at the wrong time, that certainly gives me information about them. Looking in more contemporary newspapers, LGBTQ newspapers and magazines that, we have hundreds of publications throughout the world that all started around the 1970s or later. Finding an ancestor in one of those newspapers, there's a clue. In newspapers, we also look at obituaries. The obituary will hopefully list that person's family members, their parents, any children that they may have had. It would also list their partner. And we have to be careful about how we read obituaries, because it's not necessarily going to say their husband or wife in a same-sex relationship, but it would say longtime partner, longtime companion, intimate friend. We look for those kinds of words in an obituary to get a sense of what that relationship was. In cemeteries, we can find examples of same-sex couples that were buried together. One of the most famous ones is Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas. They are buried together in Paris, and you can see that Gertrude is one side of the headstone and Alice is on the other side of the headstone. So looking at cemeteries and tombstones as to who they were buried with is another clue. Military records, unfortunately, throughout our military history in the United States, there's been a long history of discharging LGBTQ folk from serving actively. And through different periods of our history, there's a blue discharge, which was not an honorable discharge. It wasn't a dishonorable discharge either, but it did have a civil stigma attached to it, which did prevent employment, did prevent the GI Bill, did prevent VA benefits. When the military stopped using blue discharges, they went to a different system of using dishonorable discharges, undesirable discharge. And so looking at military records that are housed at the National Archives in St. Louis or Washington, D.C., if you find your ancestors' service record and their discharge, you can see were they discharged honorably. If they weren't, what was their status? And that status might also give you a clue as to what was going on in their lives at that time. So lots of other examples that I can give in terms of other records that we might find information. Police records, if they were that are available in some states, can give clues. Probate, in terms of if someone left a will, who did they leave any property to? Did they leave property to their intimate partner, other family members? We can see examples in marriage records. Now, certainly marriage is something more of the 21st century, but people have had same-sex commitment ceremonies for quite a long time. And can you find any documentation of those ceremonies, either in family heirlooms, possible local newspaper articles, or just family stories? There has been a tradition of what's been termed a Boston marriage. It's a term used in New England to describe two women living together, independent of financial support from a man. Are there any family stories that come through our ancestors about Boston marriages, or romantic friendships, or life partners? Those are the other things that I would look for in terms of the oral history that's just handed down through our own family lines. So that's a very long answer to where we would start looking for clues for these LGBTQ ancestors.
No, it's great. It's great. I just, when you were speaking, I realized that where I grew up, there were 2 Boston marriages on the street that I grew up on, and
Uh-huh.
including my next door neighbors, and who. It wasn't until I was an adult that I looked and I was like, oh, they were
Right.
lesbians. Like they had like
Right.
classic butch femme thing going on. And like, I just like grew up there, just like these old ladies, right. That like took care of me and were really sweet. But like, I was like, oh, Auntie Mary, definitely butch dyke. Yeah. Like I get it now, it's
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah.
So thanks for I love that term. I did not know that. That's great.
Yeah. So there's just this wonderful book. It's called Charity and Sylvia, A Same-Sex Marriage in Early America. It's written by Rachel Hope Cleaves in 2014. And it does describe this Boston marriage, these 2 women in the 1800s. They were together for 44 years in Vermont. And the entire community knew them as Auntie Charity and Auntie Sylvia. And they were open and they were supported by their community in Vermont. And it's just a wonderful story to be able to still have that history.
It's great. I wonder if you talk about favorite stories in your own research of finding queer ancestors. Is there anything you could share there?
I have a story that I've uncovered in my own research. This is on my son's line. My son is adopted, but it was from an open adoption, so I know both of his birth parents, and I've been able to do the genealogy of both of his birth parents. And about 4 generations ago, there was an uncle who did not have children, nor did he get married. And so that, raised a flag for me. It's like, okay, when I look into Howard a little bit more, I want to just find anything I can about his story and, why didn't he get married? What's going on there? And there's lots of reasons why people don't get married. I'm not saying anything about that, but I'm just saying it raises a red flag for me. And I found some great newspaper articles about Howard that he, in 1913, being overworked as a mortician, he was given under doctor's orders to travel to Panama and spend a month just relaxing and recuperating. And there's newspaper articles that say that he made it to Havana, Cuba, and he sent a telegram home saying that he was ill. And then the family didn't hear from him again for 35 days. And there's a series of newspaper articles that trace the search for him in South America because he was supposed to be going to Panama. And the family engaged the U.S. State Department to find Howard in Panama. And there's reports coming back from the U.S. State Department about them writing to the consul there and doing searches in different cities and just not being able to find Howard. Howard does turn up in Venezuela, again, about 35 days after his departure. And he does make it back home. And when he gets home, he says that he was staying with Mrs. Glasspool in Colombia, and that he had been treated for his illness for 10 days in a hospital. The State Department continues to investigate, and they find no Mrs. Glasspool living in that town. They interview physicians in hospitals, and no one can remember treating an American for 10 days in the hospital. So, again, this is not proof of anything, but it does raise those red flags for me. It's like, what was Howard doing? Lost in South America. He was supposed to be in Panama, but ends up in Venezuela. His story can't be corroborated when he returns. He was 27 years old at the time. He carried a lot of money with him, and I think he had a lot of opportunity for some sexual adventure. That's what I think was going on.
It's a great story.
Later in life, Howard traveled a lot to Europe. He was an organ player as well. He was an organist. And he traveled to Germany and Portugal and Spain, and also back to Haiti and the Caribbean. And he always traveled alone. I can't find him on any ship manifest with anyone that he's traveling with. And, was that an opportunity for him to liaison with other men where he was not feeling safe to do that back home? So, and then finally, Howard does have a living niece. She's elderly and lives in Florida, and I was able to speak with her, and that was a great opportunity for me. And I did ask her, so what can you tell me about your uncle? He never married. Do you know anything about him ever having a partner? And she said, well, the family always thought that he was gay. Though Howard never did have a male or female partner that anyone knew of. So, again, that helped corroborate my red flags about Howard. There's just a lot of questions about Howard and his life, and we may not ever be able to prove that someone was gay, lesbian, transgender, but if we're open to seeing a story that's not just heterosexual, if we're open to looking at our ancestry through a rainbow prism, then we might find some rich stories.
It's cool because I have done genealogy on my family of origin and had some really, amazing synchronicities, coincidences, things become revealed. But the way that you're talking about this, that the attention and care that you're putting on this one relative, and the way that you're kind of very methodically and thoroughly tracing him throughout his life, it's like he becomes a character it's not just a name, right? It's like a life.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what I love about genealogy. Certainly you can put together a tree and you can go from one ancestor to the next generation, to the next generation, the next generation. You can find some facts about when they were born and where they were born, but it really doesn't fill in any of their story. It's just names and dates. And that's interesting. But when you can really dig into someone, either through a newspaper, find an old diary, find something else that is really telling about their lives and fill in who they were, not just a birth date and a death date, but fill in who they were. That's what makes genealogy fantastic and amazing.
Yeah. Anything else you want to share, stories or tips or that could be really helpful for folks who are listening?
Let me think. Well, one of the things I also talk about is presentism. We live in a different time right now, as I said before, and we can't really apply our terminology, our thinking to the past. The past had its own rules, its own culture, its own way of doing things. So I've often asked myself about Howard, did Howard think of himself as gay? Did Howard think of himself as closeted? How did Howard self-define himself? And I may never know that. So it's just something to be aware of, that we have to leave our current way of thinking, our modern way of thinking, our 21st century being out, being married, here with us in the 21st century, so that when we look back, we don't try to say, well, why weren't they out? Why did they behave this way? Why were things going on the way that the story seems to be developing? Well, you have to put it all in context. And learning about LGBTQ history is another big, important piece of putting all of these stories together. Stonewall happened in '69, and after that, there was a gigantic opening of LGBTQ organizations, magazines, and the fight for our rights. But prior to that, there was the Mattachine Society, the Daughters of Bilitis, were organizations that started in the 1950s. So those organizations also helped put our communities together. So just knowing about when these struggles happened, when people started organizing, when people started identifying themselves as gay, lesbian, queer, when those terms came into use, is going to be important for putting our ancestors into context. And then even going further and further back in history, the concept of a Boston marriage, that was how people explained two women living together. There's an assumption that they were lesbian, but do we actually know what their intimate relationship was? We don't. We just know that they were two women living together. Anyway, hopefully I'm making sense here, but there's a whole concept of presentism and putting all of our stories into the context of LGBTQ history so that we better understand what our ancestors were going through, what they were struggling with, how open could they be, how much hiding did they have to do in order to survive.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. I mean, it's also kind of like part of cultural relativism, right? Presentism.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Like really seeing things through the lens of the time that we're in and also the culture that we're in, because there are still have been, will be other cultures who don't hold the same
Right.
heteronormative and homophobic principles that this culture holds. Yeah. Oh, I just wanted to add that there was this moment recently. I was speaking with a man who has sex with men and who is also POC, and I said something about him being gay, and he said, "I'm not gay." And I said, "What do you mean you're not gay? You only have sex with men." He's like, "Yeah, but I'm not white." Right? And and he's like, "That's a term that came out of HIV and white gay men, coming together to fight that epidemic, but that isn't really me, because I wasn't really seen in that movement, right? There was like erasure there, and I think that's a thing that I just, like, growing up like a generation behind that, it never even occurred to me, like, I was just like, men who have sex with men, they're gay. Like, I didn't put those pieces together, like, that term gay came from a particular context and is used in a particular way by a certain generation of men, right? So I think that's what you're talking about. Yeah.
Certainly in terms of self-identification is important to understand. He does not identify as gay, but he does identify as a man who has sex with other men. And what does that mean for him? I don't know. What is the resistance to the word gay? What is the resistance to the word queer for some people? What is the resistance to the term homosexual for some people? Historically, it was okay to be a homosexual. I'm talking about gay men identifying themselves as homosexual. That was okay. But when the word gay came along, they didn't like that. So some men didn't want to be called gay. They preferred to be called homosexual. Then, queer came into use, and some men didn't want to be called queer. They preferred the word gay. So yes, over time, there's been an evolution in thinking, an evolution in terminology, and people feel comfortable with their own self-identification, hopefully. And it's good to respect that, because then you can better understand them.
Yeah, it's just making me super curious, like, because I think that there's words like fop and dandy, right? There's like gender bendy words that are kind of like at the edges of my consciousness from like the 1920s. And I'm just curious, like, I'm personally curious to do some research about the languaging of queerness as it's evolved, in the United States and North America. Yeah, super helpful. Thanks, Stewart. I just wanted to mention that you have an event coming up, and to do a little plug for it, which is, I'm going to let you talk about it, but I'm just going to say where people can find information about it. But it's an event for finding queer ancestors, LGBTQ ancestors in your genealogy. And there's more information at the website californiaancestors.org. It's on Saturday, June 28th from 1 to 3 p.m. Would you just speak a little bit about it?
Sorry, it's June 23rd.
Oh, June 23rd.
Yeah, Saturday, June 23rd. Yeah, it's from 1 to 3 o'clock that day. It is my LGBTQ genealogy presentation, where I will be talking about the same sorts of things to genealogists or anyone who is interested in finding more information about their ancestors. And we'll be talking about specifically our ancestors lived in a different time. They lived in hiding. There weren't marriage records. There weren't other records that would just simply say, yes, they were in a same-sex relationship. So how do you find those clues? And again, I'll talk about the census and photographs and military records, cemetery records, some of the same things that I've said here. The presentation then also goes into our current software. As genealogists, we need to put all this information somewhere. And there are various software applications that we can utilize, and there are several websites that we can utilize. And I talk about how our current software is lacking in many places to document our LGBTQ families. And I give recommendations as well about how we might address that and fix it and develop better software.
That's great. Yeah. I just want to put a personal plug in for your event. For folks who are already doing ancestor work, that doing the ancestry work, the genealogy work can just be really confirming and validating of what you're finding, right? And really like when I started doing the genealogy work, I just thought, oh, this is, kind of the names and dates like we were talking about with Stewart. And then as the connections started to be made and life started to be moving through the process of maybe having a dream about oh, I should go to this website and then finding information about an ancestor there, right? It was like a more fluid process of feeling like I was being guided by my ancestors into my ancestry. So that these two things can really complement each other. And
yes.
If you are really interested in learning more about how to find your queer ancestors, I really highly recommend Stewart's class. So check it out. It's in the Bay Area.
Yes.
Yeah. So Stewart, thank you so much for sharing your expertise on this topic and just for the way that you're holding the work really tenderly. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Pavini. It's been fantastic to talk with you.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode of Bespoken Bones. And if you have felt moved by what you've heard and you'd like to learn more, go ahead and check it out on my website, trancestralhealing.com. And you can learn there about the sexual and ancestral wellness work that I offer, and as well as the monthly ancestral healing circles that I'm facilitating in the Bay. Love to hear from you there. And just also wanting to send a little prayer to all of our ancestors that this work moves through us in good ways, that it moves into the world with healing and kindness for all of us. So I'm Pavini Moray, and I will be back every full and new moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom. Thank you.